Hi, I'm Father Jim Martin. Welcome to Faith in Focus. We're delighted to have you with us. This show is all about faith, what faith means to you, and how you live your faith every day. In this month's episode, we'll talk with Ashley McKinless, an associate editor at America Media, about Pope Francis's new letter to young people. Then we'll talk with the celebrated poet and memoirist Mary Karr about what drew her to Catholicism. In our People of God segment, British Robinson, the president of the Barbara Bush Foundation, will tell us what she learned from giving up a promising career in banking to work full-time with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. Finally, we'll reflect on the Easter season and how we can find signs of the resurrection in daily life. We hope you enjoy this episode of Faith in Focus. Today in our news segment, I am pleased to welcome Ashley McKinless, an associate editor here at America Media. Ashley is also one of the hosts of Jesuitical, a podcast for young Catholics. Welcome to Faith in Focus, Ashley.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
My pleasure. One of the things you recently talked about on Jesuitical was Pope Francis's apostolic exhortation to young people, which was published last month. It's called Christus Vivit, or Christ is Alive. It's a follow-up to the Synod on Young People that the Vatican held last fall. As someone who hosts a podcast for young Catholics and as a young Catholic yourself, can you tell me what stood out to you from this document? Did you feel challenged by anything in particular, Ashley?
Yeah, I did feel challenged by it, but I also felt affirmed. The challenging part was when Pope Francis wrote about how young people can withdraw into small groups when they're faced with the problems in the church and the world. He says that these little groups can easily become an extension of our own ego. And he reminds young Catholics that they need to be dedicated to charity in both our society and families. And that got me thinking about the ways that I can often live in my own little Catholic bubble, or think that because I'm, quote, a professional Catholic working at a Jesuit ministry, that I don't need to do any more work for justice, when in fact I do.
Yeah, I think that's a real temptation for many of us in ministry because we think that since we have a job in the church, we don't need to do anything else to be good Christians. You mentioned you also felt affirmed by this document. Ashley, what made you feel that way?
There's this one passage in which the Pope says that young people should be agents of youth ministry. He says he won't provide a lot of guidelines because he wants to encourage young people to use their own gifts and insights to reach other young people in their own language. And that's exactly what I try to do on our podcast, Jesuitical. We're meeting young people where they are and speaking their language. A lot of young people might not read a 200-page apostolic exhortation, but they might listen to a 30-minute podcast about it.
Well, Ashley, you and the Jesuitical team are doing a great job of what Pope Francis is talking about here. One last question. What would you say in this document gave you hope?
I really loved how Pope Francis ended the document. It ends with this beautiful passage in which the Pope says to young people, "Keep running the race that's laid out before you, because the Church needs your momentum and your faith." And he says, if you arrive there before the rest of us, please have the patience to wait for us. This passage acknowledges the distance that a lot of young people feel between them and the Church, but it also expresses the hope that through the work of the Holy Spirit, those divisions will be overcome.
That's lovely. Ashley, thank you so much for joining us on Faith in Focus. You can find Ashley's podcast, Jesuitical, on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. Up next, we'll introduce you to this month's guest, Mary Karr. Faith in Focus is made possible by generous donors. To give your support or learn more about the show, visit americamag.org/faithshow. Thank you and God bless you.
Hi, I'm Katie. I'm a teacher. I first encountered Mary Karr's books when I was in the hospital a few years ago. I was going through inpatient treatment for anorexia, and my mom brought me this book, Lit, and said, "Here, I think you might like it." Lit is Mary Karr's memoir about finding both sobriety and her Catholic faith. So she starts the book off still struggling with alcoholism and a marriage that's falling apart. And she's really struggling to admit that she has an issue, which was something I could relate to a lot. So it was 2016 when I first read Lit. 3 years later, I am about to join the Catholic Church. I had never read anything by a Catholic writer before Mary Karr. I was very skeptical of the Catholic Church. I had a lot of preconceived notions, and something in Lit really dispelled those for me and showed me a different side of what being Catholic could be. I found myself really attracted to the repetition. Mary Karr actually says there's a carnality to Mass, you're doing this ritual with your body, you're very present in your worship of God, and that was a new experience for me. And then praying the Rosary was also, again, that ritual of doing something with my body, connecting to God, was something I'd never encountered in Christianity before. It feels very specifically Catholic in a lot of ways, and that just gave me this presence of God that I hadn't previously experienced. I don't know if I could have started RCIA without seeing a Catholic writer who I admire so much say, yeah, I'm not there on every church teaching, but I'm still very much here in the church with the people experiencing my faith fully. Mary Karr is not exactly who I think most people think of when you think of what a Catholic looks like, at least non-Catholic people. Mary Karr, curses, she writes about a lot of content that maybe you wouldn't expect from a Catholic writer, and mainly she isn't perfect. I think I had this idea that people in the Catholic Church were very hoity-toity, I am a very holy saint, which I've learned is very wrong, but seeing a writer who is so real and honest about who she is showed me that maybe there was something beyond the saints that I had read about. Maybe there were real people there too. I got to meet Mary, and I let her know that she had a huge impact on me deciding to recover from my eating disorder, and also in me considering conversion. I was just about to enter RCIA at that point, and she gave me a big hug and told me how happy she was to meet me and that she was going to be praying for me. And that was really incredible to have someone who's been a hero and been a huge impact through her writing send me that wish and gift of her prayers. Yeah, it was really amazing. I'm getting a little teary because I was definitely sobbing that day. As someone who is far from perfect and definitely in process with my faith and what it means to live a Christ-like life, I think it's nice to have someone who can be so funny and honest about who she is and the life that she's led and the experiences that she's had. It also is a reminder that Catholicism doesn't have to be somber. I think a lot of people get that idea from big cathedrals, and I think Mary is a reminder that there's joy in the church and laughter, and I think that's wonderful.
Today I'm pleased to welcome my good friend Mary Karr to the show. Mary is the author of 3 best-selling memoirs, including The Liars Club and Lit, the story of, as she says, her journey from black belt sinner and lifelong agnostic to unlikely Catholic. She is also an award-winning poet, and her 5th collection of poetry, Tropic of Squalor, is out now. Welcome to Faith in Focus, Mary.
Thank you, Father Jay.
Nice to have you here.
It's nice to be had. You didn't tell them the main thing the sneaky thing that you don't want me to tell, that I'm going to tell anyway, because
please.
You're my spiritual director.
Mm-hmm, that's true.
So that means that I sit in a room and sob quietly, and you say benedictions over me.
That's
pretty
exactly
much it.
That's exactly what we do,
That's
right?
Pretty much what it's like.
Well, we're going to look a little bit at your span of your life. I want to start with what people are probably most interested in. How did you become a writer?
I used Shakespeare as a booster seat, the
Okay.
Riverside Shakespeare, when I was a little girl. And as early as I could remember, I was trying to write poems. And if you had asked me at age 5 what I wanted to be, I would have said I wanted to be a poet. And then I was always memorizing poems. I memorized a lot of the Winnie the Pooh poems and E. E. Cummings when I was a little girl. And starting really young, when I was, 12, I was memorizing Shakespeare speeches, which my mother was kind of a heavy drinker, let's say, and she thought I was clever if I could amuse her. So I was like a little kind of performing chimpanzee in our sort of hard-drinking household, and part of that involved memorizing and saying poetry.
And then the writing continued through high school and college, did it?
High school and college. In college, I never took I took a creative writing class. I never took an English class because I was afraid they would tell me I wasn't smart enough to be a poet. So I was sort of very insecure about it. I was one of those students who would do really well and then not show up for like several months. I dropped out of high school, and I was always like running away to something. So
How about now? You started as a poet then. But you're very well known for your memoirs. Do you like writing poetry better than memoir?
absolutely,
Why is that?
because not as many people read it, so I'm less self-conscious. Poetry was my first love. They give me money to write memoirs. I mean, forgive me, it's a little like turning a trick. I guess we can say that on Faith and Focus.
Feel free. In what ways is it like turning a trick?
Well, it's so hard to write the memoirs. In some ways, I do feel it's a calling. Like starting really young, I read autobiographies, and when I was in my 1965 journal, so I was 10 years old, I wrote, I'm not very successful as a little girl. When I grow up, I will write one half poetry and one half autobiography, and I will probably be a mess.
How old were you when you predicted that?
I was 10.
Wow. Now, you describe yourself as an unlikely Catholic. How does your faith influence your writing or your practice?
Well, I grew up in an agnostic household, which in the 50s and 60s was weird, and especially in Bible Belt, Texas. So people weren't allowed to come in our yard. It wasn't, I mean, it was like my parents drank, and my mother had a job and wore shorts and, smoked and drank. And, it was a racy, painted nudes. And so it was like a racy, weirdo household. And so I was an agnostic my whole life. And my son got me to go to church when he was little. He said I said, why do you want to go to church, sort of cynically? And he said, to see if God's there. And it was such what other reason to go to church? And I thought, well, I didn't like soccer either. So we did this thing we called God-orama, and we went to all these different churches our friends went to. We went to a Zendo and like a Jewish Midrash and, Southern Baptist churches. And I met I now think of him as a really amazing priest. He was very un-Jesuit-like, I have to say.
We can forgive him for that.
Yeah, exactly.
Where was this?
This was in Syracuse, New York. So Father Joseph Kane, and I realize now how almost no one else could have converted me. He was exactly what I was not interested in. I remember when I did the Ignatian exercises, asking him, did you ever do those? He said, oh, I could never read all those books. So he was but he was incredibly humble. Like one of the things that he did, he lived his life as though whoever came in front of him was sent by Jesus.
So you found your way to the church essentially through him. You talked about the Ignatian exercises. What's your pretend I'm not your spiritual director. I answer this for our viewers. What's your prayer life like? What is a?
Well, I get up in the morning and I pray every morning. I do. I would say probably 10, 15 minutes of centering prayer, and then maybe 10 minutes of Lectio Divina.
Can you describe what that means for you, maybe to people who don't know what those things are?
Yeah, so like centering prayer, it can be any dumb thing to quiet your mind. So I started out counting my breaths, 1 to 10 over and over. And now lately I've been doing the Jesus prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, a sinner, as a kind of mantra. But the idea is just to get myself quiet. And then I read the liturgy, Lectio Divina, I read the liturgy for the day, and I try to just see if anything about it speaks specifically to me or to my life. And then at night, and sometimes in the morning also, I do something called the Examen of Conscience, where I go over my day, kind of like you're pressing play on a video recorder, and I kind of watched, like then I woke up and I got coffee, and I try to kind of not just make a list of places I saw God, but really kind of relive that day through imagination, through, oh yeah, I was really thirsty when I first woke up, and wow, that first cup of coffee was really good, and then those moments, sometimes they're very strange. Like there was a moment before I walked out of my house, and there was a man screaming on the street, a big guy screaming at the sky like, murder or suicide, murder or suicide. And everybody was walking around him, and I started to walk around him, and then I just thought, this man is my brother, and he's suffering. And I just said, excuse me, like, isn't there like another door, or isn't there a third option other than murder or suicide? And he cocked his head at the sky and kind of seemed to be thinking. And so that was a moment that I might have just forgotten. But in that reflection, I remembered being a little afraid of him, and tried to be in that place and think that that call to speak to him really was a call from God or the Holy Spirit, guiding me to try to connect with somebody who might have been in pain. So
great. So the examine for you is, as it is for a lot of people, a prayer of noticing where God is. Is that right?
it is, and but it's also made me change the way I live, because I teach. I make my living not as a writer. I make my living not as a writer, but as an undistinguished, sort of school marm. And so I teach, and like everybody who teaches, I spent a lot of time complaining. It was just a habit. Like you would put up office hours and they would fill, and then you would have to add more hours to meet everybody, and my writing and every other thing. I'm so important, Jim. You probably didn't know this about me, but I have a lot of very important...
It's nice to know now.
It's nice to know. Very important things that I'm thinking I have to do, like get my mascara on and get my nails done, and things really essential to my life and death. And so I would complain about those students, but from doing the examen, which I started doing, I guess, 15 years ago, almost 20, I noticed every single time somebody came into my office to show me their poems or their memoir, their novel, or just to talk about their lives or the life of a writer, to ask advice, God was always there. And so I just noticed in that savoring, even students who didn't particularly like me or who were angry at me would come in and complain about something I was doing in class. Even, when it was difficult, or I was trying to get them to do something they didn't want to do, or there was some conflict, or two students would be having a conflict, I would bring, even when it was, awkward, I noticed God was always there with me. So I doubled the number of office hours I do. So I see way more students than most people. And so then I started, like, I commute up to Syracuse and commute back to New York. I started having dinner with whoever came in the afternoon. I would take them to dinner, like make that a thing where I would have extra time with them. So it really has changed in that way by noticing where God is. I think I have to write my big important books.
Right. I mean, what turns out to be important for you in your life are these students too,
right.
not whatever other things you think might be important. Where's Jesus in all this? Who is Jesus for you?
I just redid the exercises in 2017, and you and I were doing direction at the time, so we talked about these. One of the ways you do them is you imagine yourself in these Bible scenes, and I had these very rich meditations of Mary, who I'd never had much feeling for, of Jesus as a boy, and I even had before his ministry, so you actually try to put yourself in that scene, that same sort of imaginative work where you try to be in the room with him. And I had when I'd done the exercises before, Jesus didn't have any pores. He was very airbrushed and like,
Mm-hmm.
and this, I saw him, that idea of being born a human, having all the power that there is, and all this luminous mystery of creation is at your fingertips, and you decide to put on like a meat mask and go take a butt whipping from a bunch of Romans. It's going to be a long line. It's going to be a short line of people who are going to sign up for that,
Mm-hmm.
for that duty. And so I guess for me, the risen Christ, as well as Jesus as a human being, I guess, are both very central in my meditation on the scriptures.
Sure, and they're the same person, right?
That's
Yeah.
that's the nutty part.
Mm-hmm. It is nutty, and beautiful. That's a good place to end. I just want to thank you, Mary, for joining us today and also sharing so much of your faith with us today.
Thank you.
My pleasure. You can find all of Mary's books, including her new poetry collection, Tropic of Squalor, wherever books are sold. Today on People of God, we are talking with my good friend British Robinson, who is the president and CEO of the Barbara Bush Foundation. She also worked for the Jesuit Conference of Canada and the United States for several years and is beloved by many Jesuits and many Jesuit ministries. Welcome to Faith in Focus, British.
Thanks, Father Jim. How are you today?
I'm great. Good to see you, and thanks for joining us. British, you left a promising career in banking to work with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. Can you tell us about your discernment and how that came to be?
Sure. Well, it was an interesting, almost strange sort of process. I was about 3 to 4 years into my banking career, and I just felt a pulling, a calling, almost drawing to something, and I didn't know why. And I kept thinking, I don't think this is what I'm supposed to be doing. I think there's something else to life. And so I took some time off and had a bit of a sabbatical at the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and decided that that drawing and calling was drawing me something that I wouldn't fully realize for probably decades later. And that really was to be of service. And as the Jesuits would say, to be on mission. And I entered the Jesuit Volunteer Corps and was a social worker for Catholic Charities in Mobile, Alabama. It changed my life. It was my big aha God moment. And then I understood what I was being called to. And that was really to serve the people of God in that setting, in that situation, learning all about affordable housing issues and welfare reform and healthcare reform and people living really in abject poverty in Mobile, Alabama. It really opened my eyes in such broad and deep ways that I think to this day still serves me in my new career.
Was there some particular moment or Bible verse or something that stood out for you in terms of your discernment, in terms of that aha moment?
In our house, we went to a sort of closing mass with my other 8 community members, and there was a flyer that someone handed us as we were leaving, a sort of picture, goodbye card, and it was Jeremiah 29. The plans I have for you are to prosper. And that really stuck in my mind that whatever I choose to do in service, that it was part of my journey, part of my life's work, if you will. Prospering means you can do other things. You don't have to just make money in banking. And those other things came fully into focus, I think no pun intended, after my 10-year tenure at the Jesuit Conference, working on refugee issues and other social concern issues through the policy lens. And then moving on from that, Jim, and going to the State Department, where I was really blessed to work on President Bush's HIV/AIDS global program called the President's Plan for HIV and AIDS. And that just set up a dynamic where I could really see what it meant to be on mission and see that in a global setting with those suffering from HIV and AIDS.
You've had a really amazing career and have, so many more years ahead of you. And a lot of it turned on that discernment and the retreat and even that Bible verse. And I think a lot of people might ask, well, how do you know that that's God's voice, right? How do you know that those feelings of being drawn and the kind of insight you got from Jeremiah 29 or God's voice, what would you say to someone who says, how can I discern if that's really coming from God or if it's just in my mind?
Right. That's an excellent question. I think, Jim, there is an utter and complete peace that comes over you. So I talked about that pulling, that kind of almost angst, that uncomfortableness. All of that goes away. I believe when you are fully living out your purpose, your life's purpose. It's part of who you are. It's part of who I am. It sits at the core of my being, and there's a comfort that I feel every day, knowing that I've answered my call.
Well, that's great. So it's not just the kind of feeling sort of spiritually, it's also intellectually knowing that you are fulfilling your talents. British, I want to thank you for sharing your faith life with us, and thanks for all your great service to the Jesuits and the people of God.
Thanks, Jim. Great to be with you.
If you have a story to share about how God has touched your life, send it to us at americamag.org/faithshow. Today in our Life in the Spirit segment, we're taking you to the garden on the roof of my Jesuit community here in New York City to reflect on the Easter season. Just a few weeks ago, it was too cold for any of these flowers to survive. In fact, it was hard to imagine that anything could live in this climate. But now, with the sun shining and the flowers planted and blooming, new life is all around us. And maybe in this new season, we find ourselves feeling different too, as we emerge from a somber Lent and winter and into the joy of Easter and spring. Sometimes, though, it's harder for us to see the joy of the resurrection in our own lives. Maybe we've had a hard time keeping our Lenten promises, or are going through a difficult time in life. Maybe, like the disciples, we've recently lost someone close to us. It was hard for the disciples to recognize the resurrection too. Remember, even Mary Magdalene, one of Jesus' closest friends, mistook the risen Christ for a gardener until he spoke to her. And the disciples on the road to Emmaus didn't recognize Jesus until he prayed and broke bread with them. The resurrection is not always easy to recognize. That's why the Church gives us an entire liturgical season, longer than Lent, to celebrate and ponder Christ's rising from the dead and his victory over everything that separates us from God. I say ponder because, as the saying goes, the resurrection is a mystery to be contemplated, not a problem to be figured out. And one of the ways to ponder it is by looking for signs of it in our own lives and reflecting on it in our prayer. So in this 50 days of the Easter season, maybe you can ask yourself, where am I seeing signs of the resurrection in my daily life? I hope you enjoyed this episode of Faith in Focus. To support the show and share your faith story, visit americamag.org/faithshow. We'll have a new episode soon, and you can subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss it. See you on the next episode of Faith in Focus.